In the stillness of the night, where the cold air bit at my exposed skin, I found myself walking the familiar path home from the gas station. The job was mundane, a monotonous blend of fuel fumes and idle chatter. Yet it provided a semblance of stability in my otherwise unremarkable life. My name is Edward, 20 years of age, with a little to my name, but the uniform on my back and the dreams in my head. The streets of our town, usually bustling with life, lay silent under the heavy blanket of night. The occasional flicker of a street lamp cast long, distorted shadows that danced eerily on the pavement. I've always found comfort in the quiet, a respite from the constant hum of the day. Yet tonight, the silence felt oppressive, as if the air itself was thick with unspoken forebodings. As I trudged along, the crisp sound of my footsteps echoed off the buildings, a solitary rhythm in the otherwise mute world. The cold was biting, seeping through my jacket, gnawing at my bones. I remember thinking of the warmth awaiting me at home, a small apartment barely a few blocks away. My mind wandered to the mundane, a hot shower, a simple meal, perhaps an hour of television before surrendering to sleep. But then, the ordinary was shattered by a rustling sound, subtle yet distinct, slicing through the stillness. Instinctively, I turned, peering into the darkness. There stood a figure, tall and imposing, shrouded in the night's embrace. His features were obscured, hidden in the shadows, but the very air around him seemed charged with a malevolent energy. A surge of fear gripped me, primal and unyielding. I was about to call out, to demand his intentions, when a sudden, sharp blow to my head snuffed out my consciousness like a candle in the wind. I crumbled to the ground, my world fading to black. In the hazy limbo of semi-awareness, I felt myself being dragged, the rough pavement scraping against my skin. The sensation shifted, and I realized I was no longer on the street, but being hauled onto a creaking cart. It jostled and bumped, the sound of its wheels a discordant melody as it trundled through what I assumed to be the forest that skirted our town. My mind, clouded and disoriented, struggled to piece together the fragments of reality. Pain throbbed at the back of my skull, a persistent reminder of my predicament. Fear, raw and unfiltered, coursed through me, yet I was powerless to act, my body unresponsive, my voice a mere whisper lost in the night. Consciousness returned to me like a reluctant tide, ebbing and flowing on the shores of my awareness. The darkness that enveloped me was complete, a shroud that obscured all but the faintest outlines of my surroundings. I lay still for a moment, letting the fog in my mind dissipate, replaced by a throbbing pain that pulsated from the back of my head. My senses, dulled by the blow and the shock, gradually began to sharpen. The cold was pervasive, seeping into my bones, an unwelcome reminder of my vulnerability. I realized with a start that my clothes were gone, my skin exposed to the chill of the air. The rough concrete beneath me offered no comfort, only a hard, unyielding surface against my bruised body. In the suffocating blackness, the sound of breathing, not my own, reached my ears. It was labored, the kind that spoke of fear and exhaustion. I wasn't alone. My eyes, straining to penetrate the darkness, slowly adjusted. Shapes began to materialize, vague and indistinct, yet unmistakably human. Other men, like me, huddled in the shadows, their naked forms barely discernible. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had been kidnapped, snatched from the familiar streets of my town and thrust into this hellish place. The why and the how of it escaped me, lost in the murky depths of my clouded thoughts. I tried to move, to rise, but my body protested. Pain shot through me, a stark reminder of my ordeal. My head swam, and for a moment, I feared I would succumb to the darkness once more. But I fought it, clinging to consciousness with a desperation born of fear. As my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, the details of my prison became clearer. The basement, if that's what it was, reeked of damp and decay. The air was stale, heavy with a sense of despair that seemed almost tangible. The walls, what little I could see of them, were bare, the concrete stained with age and neglect. The other captives, their faces etched with terror and confusion, shrank back as I stirred. We were united in our plight, yet isolated by our own fears. No words were spoken. The silence was as oppressive as the darkness. I tried to recall the events that led me here, to piece together the fragments of my memory. The walk home, the figure in the darkness, the sudden searing pain. It all seemed like a nightmare, yet here I was, living it. The woman beside me, her features barely discernible in the dim light, was a specter of fear. I tried to speak to her, but she was frightened and hurriedly covered my mouth with her hand. Her cold and trembling hand was both a warning and a plea. "Shh, don't talk. They will come. Don't speak. I beg you," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound in the oppressive silence. Her warning was a stark reminder of our vulnerability, a testament to the unseen yet ever-present threat that loomed over us like a malevolent shadow. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her fear, and her hand reluctantly withdrew. Her caution, born of experience, was a chilling indicator of the dangers that lurked beyond our sight, in the depths of this hellish place. As my gaze wandered through the gloom, the reality of our plight became increasingly evident. The basement, a cavern of despair, housed a tableau of human suffering. Naked bodies, emaciated and broken, lay scattered across the cold concrete, each a silent testament to the cruelty they had endured. Heads bowed, eyes downcast, they seemed to have surrendered to their fate, their spirits as shattered as their bodies. Nearby, a figure caught my attention. A man whose plight was a horrifying aberration of the human form. His limbs had been severed, leaving him a truncated shadow of his former self. He lay on his back, writhing in agony, his movements reminiscent of a wounded animal. From his lips, barely audible above the faint echoes of the basement, came a prayer, a whisper of faith in the face of unimaginable suffering. The sight of him, mutilated and diminished, stirred a visceral reaction within me. Nausea welled up, a tide of revulsion that threatened to overwhelm my senses. I covered my mouth with my hand, fighting back the urge to retch, my stomach churning in protest. The air was thick with despair, a tangible presence that weighed heavily upon us all. The stench of decay, the dampness of the walls, the chill of the air, all conspired to create an atmosphere of hopeless desolation. As I sat there, amidst the broken and the lost, I felt a profound sense of helplessness. My thoughts turned to my captors, faceless and unknown, their motives as obscure as the darkness that surrounded us. What twisted purpose drove them to inflict such suffering? What perverse satisfaction did they derive from our torment? Time in the basement was an elusive creature, skulking in the shadows, indifferent to the rhythms of the sun and moon. I could not tell how long I had been in this hellish limbo. Perhaps a day, perhaps two. My body screamed for water, my throat parched and burning. Hunger gnawed at me, a relentless tormentor. Yet these physical afflictions paled in comparison to the psychological torture of waiting, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The others in the basement, my unwilling companions in this nightmare, remained silent, each lost in their private hells. Attempts at communication were met with fearful glances or outright avoidance. In this void of despair, I began to question reality. Perhaps this was all a horrific dream, a figment of my imagination run amok. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it offered an escape, a return to normalcy. Terrifying because I knew, deep down, that this nightmare was all too real. Then, on a day indistinguishable from the others, something shifted. Our senses, honed by the darkness, detected a change. First, it was the sound of footsteps above us. Not the light, furtive steps of a cautious intruder, but heavy, deliberate strides, echoing with a sense of ominous purpose. The reaction in the basement was immediate and visceral. Whispers of fear hissed through the air, bodies pressed against the walls in a futile attempt to merge with the concrete. The atmosphere thickened with dread, a palpable force that seemed to constrict our very breaths. The sound of a lock disengaging, metal grating against metal, sent a shiver down my spine. The hatch, our only connection to the world above, was being opened. A sliver of hope flickered within me, swiftly extinguished by the realization that whatever was coming was unlikely to herald our salvation. Instead of light, a deeper darkness descended upon us. It was as if the very essence of darkness had been distilled and poured into our basement. My eyes, already accustomed to the dimness, struggled against this new, impenetrable blackness. It was an oppressive, suffocating void that seemed to devour the scant light we had known. The figures around me, once barely visible in the gloom, vanished into the enveloping black. A sense of isolation, more profound than before, settled over me. The sounds of breathing and quiet sobs were muffled, as if the darkness itself was a barrier to sound. In this abyss, the footsteps continued, now descending into the basement. Each step resonated with a foreboding weight, a herald of unknown horrors. I felt a primitive urge to flee, to escape this impending doom, but there was nowhere to hide, no escape from this inescapable pit. In the suffocating blackness of the basement, the sounds heralded a new horror. The noise, initially distant and indistinct, grew louder, a series of quiet thumps and scrapes that echoed through the void. Each sound was a sinister symphony, an orchestra of dread playing a tune that resonated with the most primal parts of my soul. The atmosphere thickened with terror, as palpable as the damp air that filled the room. It was as if the very essence of fear had materialized, a tangible force that coiled around us, squeezing tighter with each passing second. My heart raced, a frantic drumbeat in my chest, mirroring the escalating tempo of our collective anxiety. The sounds, drawing closer, were unlike anything I had ever heard. They were guttural, almost inhuman, a cacophony of clicks and wheezes that seemed to speak of something otherworldly. The noises defied logic, painting a picture of creatures born, not of this earth, but of nightmares and shadowed corners of the mind. I, along with the others, lay frozen in terror, our breaths held in a vice of fear. We were united, not by bonds of friendship or kinship, but by the common thread of dread that wove through our every thought. The darkness, once merely an absence of light, now felt like a living entity, a malevolent presence that pressed against my skin, cold and clammy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a primal reaction to the unseen threat that lurked just beyond the veil of darkness. My eyes, straining to see through the impenetrable black, saw nothing but the dark canvas of my own fear. In that moment of terror, time seemed to stretch and warp, the seconds elongating into an eternity of anticipation. The sounds continued to approach, each thump and scrape a step closer to an unknown fate. My mind raced, conjuring images of what horrors might be producing such nightmarish noises. The rest of the captives were statuesque in their terror, a tableau of despair frozen in the darkness. We were bound not just by the walls of our prison, but by the shared horror of what was to come. In the heart of that inky blackness, a terror beyond comprehension emerged. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form, manifesting into a creature so grotesque, so alien to the human mind, that it defied reality. My eyes, wide with horror, struggled to make sense of the apparition before us. The creature was a monstrous amalgamation of wool, fangs, and claws, a nightmare made flesh. Its form seemed to shift and warp, distorting the very air around it. Its movements were disjointed, jerky, as if it operated under laws of physics unknown to our world. This being, this shapeshifter, was an affront to nature, a violation of all that was logical and understood. Then, in a moment that seemed to freeze time, the creature reached for one of us. It was the man who had been mutilated, the one whose prayers had been a whisper of hope in the darkness. His screams shattered the silence, a desperate plea for mercy. "No, don't. Leave me, leave me, leave me." The rest of us were statues, paralyzed by a terror so profound it bordered on the surreal. Eyes wide, mouths agape, we were witnesses to an unfathomable horror, our minds grappling with the reality of what we were seeing. Tears flowed silently down the faces of some, while others mouthed silent prayers, their lips moving in a fervent plea to a higher power. I sat there, my body rigid with fear, my mind a whirlwind of panic and desperation. Thoughts of escape, of survival, collided with the paralyzing terror that gripped me. In that moment, I was lost, adrift in a sea of fear, with no lifeline in sight. The creature, this werewolf of the abyss, began to move away, dragging the screaming man behind it. His cries for mercy echoed in the chamber, a haunting refrain that would forever be etched in my memory. The sound of his terror followed the beast, fading only when the manhole cover slammed shut with a resounding crash. Silence descended upon us once more, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to mock our plight. The darkness, once merely a physical absence of light, now felt imbued with a malevolent presence. It was as if the creature had left a part of itself behind, a lingering reminder of the horror we had just witnessed. In the oppressive confines of the basement, time ceased to be a measure of life. It became a continuous cycle of fear and despair, an endless loop where days and nights lost their meaning. We existed in a perpetual twilight, our senses dulled by the monotony of terror and pain. Fear, I came to realize, was not just an emotion. It was a primal force, an entity that consumed rational thought and hope. It was a beast that lurked in the shadows of our minds, feeding on our despair, growing stronger with each passing moment. Our captors, faceless emissaries of cruelty, wielded fear like a weapon. Their visits were sudden, violent whirlwinds that left destruction in their wake. They would appear without warning, their heavy footsteps and harsh voices heralding a new wave of terror. They took people at random, dragging them from our midst into the unknown. Sometimes they returned, but they were changed, broken. Limbs were missing, eyes vacant, their bodies bearing the gruesome testimony of unimaginable horrors. Others were not so fortunate, disappearing into the abyss, never to be seen again. The beatings were arbitrary, a cruel game of pain and humiliation. We were defenseless, our naked bodies vulnerable to their brutality. Each blow was a stark reminder of our helplessness, a message that our lives were at their mercy. In that hellish place, we sought comfort in the only thing we had left: each other. Our bodies huddled together for warmth, a pitiful attempt to find some solace in our shared misery. We were a mass of flesh and bone, pressed together in a desperate bid for human connection. The air in the basement was heavy with the stench of decay, a constant reminder of the death that surrounded us. Breathing became a struggle, each inhalation a battle against the overwhelming odor that permeated our prison. Our existence was a grotesque parody of life, a macabre dance of survival in the face of relentless horror. Every moment was a fight against the darkness, both literal and figurative, that sought to claim us. The sound of footsteps, a rhythm we had come to dread, echoed once more in our dismal chamber. But this time, something was different. The steps were cautious, hesitant. It was a sound that spoke not of the brutish confidence of our captors, but of fear, uncertainty. Instinctively, we retreated to the walls, our bodies pressed against the cold, damp concrete. The familiar embrace of fear gripped us, a tightening noose around our collective neck. Hope had long since faded, leaving behind a resignation to whatever cruel fate awaited us. Then, as the hatch creaked open, spilling a sliver of light into our world of shadows, something shifted within me. The light, feeble and flickering, was a stark contrast to the all-consuming darkness we had grown accustomed to. Descending the ladder, illuminated by the faint glow of a lighter, were two figures, a father and his son. The light danced across their faces, casting a ghostly pallor on their features. The father's voice, a mere whisper, broke the silence. It was a prayer, spoken with a disbelief that resonated in the air. The words, trembling and fragile, were a testament to their shattered reality. In the flickering light, I saw their faces more clearly. The father, his features lined with fatigue and fear, held the lighter with a trembling hand. His eyes, darting around the room, took in the sight of us. A collection of broken souls huddled in the darkness. The son clung to his father, his face etched with a confusion and fear that was heartbreakingly young. Their presence, this unexpected intrusion of light, sparked a flicker of something within me. It was not hope. That was a luxury too costly to afford, but a stirring of curiosity, a flicker of interest in a world beyond our own. The basement, for a brief moment, was transformed. The light, though weak, cut through the darkness, revealing the faces of my fellow captives. Eyes that had grown used to the gloom now reflected the light, flickering with a mixture of fear and wonder. The father and son stood at the foot of the ladder, their bodies tense, as if ready to flee at the slightest provocation. It was clear they were as lost and scared as we were, their arrival not an act of aggression, but of accidental intrusion. As the father and son stood at the threshold of our prison, the collective despair of us captives found voice. "Help us," we whispered, our voices a chorus of desperation, echoing off the damp walls. The air, thick with the stench of decay, carried our pleas like the whispers of ghosts. My own voice startled me. It sounded alien, a creaky, rasping shadow of its former self. The years of silence and terror had transformed it into something unrecognizable, a haunting reminder of the time that had slipped away in this abyss. The boy's father, a mask of fear and confusion frozen on his face, ordered his son to run and began hurrying him to leave the basement. In a final, desperate bid for freedom, I crawled towards them, my movements slow and labored. My body, weakened by hunger and abuse, protested each inch I gained. Beside me, another captive, a man whose body bore the scars of our shared hell, moved with a grim determination. His voice, barely more than a hoarse whisper, carried a plea that resonated with all of us. "Please leave the lid open. They are out there in the woods, but don't close the lid. Please." It was a request born of desperation, a slender thread of hope that we clung to. The father hesitated, his face a battleground of conflicting emotions. Sympathy warred with fear, the desire to help struggling against the primal urge to flee. In that moment, he was every bit as trapped as we were, caught between the horrors of this place and the instinct to protect his child. Then, in a rush of movement, they turned and fled, disappearing up the ladder into the unknown world above. The brief glimmer of light from the father's lighter was extinguished, plunging us once again into darkness. But fate, in its unpredictable way, offered a small mercy. The father's lighter fell from his grasp, clattering onto the concrete floor. My fingers, numb and trembling, found it in the darkness. With a flick of my thumb, the flame came to life, casting a feeble glow in the suffocating gloom. Emboldened by the light, however small, I began to ascend the ladder. Each step was an act of will, a defiance of the despair that had held us captive. The lighter's flame flickered with my movements, a beacon in the darkness, guiding my way. Emerging from the depths of the basement, I found myself in the remnants of a house long surrendered to decay. Its walls, cloaked in shadows and silence, echoed with the absence of life. The father and son had vanished, their fleeting presence a mere ghost in our story of survival. Behind me, the other captives stumbled out, their movements labored and unsteady. We were a procession of the damned, each step a testament to our endured hell. The air outside was a balm to our abused senses. Crisp, cold, the scent of freedom laced with the earthiness of the forest. I led the way, my legs unsteady yet driven by a newfound purpose. The house, nestled in the embrace of the woods, stood as a silent sentinel to our escape. Its windows, like sightless eyes, gazed blankly into the forest, holding secrets of its own. When we got outside, the contrast between our prison and the world around us was stark. The forest, with its tall trees and whispering leaves, was a world alive with both beauty and menace. The ground beneath our feet, carpeted with fallen leaves and snow, crunched with every step. Our movements were akin to those of the undead, each of us a shadow of our former selves. Hunger, pain, and fear had reduced us to mere husks, our humanity hanging by a thread. But our nightmare, it seemed, was far from over. From the depths of the forest, a growl shattered the silence, a sound so primal and terrifying it froze us in our tracks. It was a growl that spoke of hunger, of predation, a sound that belonged to the wild, untamed heart of the woods. Tall, sinister figures emerged from the shadows, their presence a dark reminder of the evil that had held us captive. One of them, a man of unnatural stature, began to transform before our eyes. His body contorted, his movements becoming bestial, a grotesque metamorphosis that defied nature. Beside him, a woman underwent a similar change, her form twisting into a creature of nightmares, a monstrous being of shadow and malice. They were the embodiment of our fears, the physical manifestation of the horrors we had endured. Panic surged through me, a tidal wave of fear that threatened to sweep away the fragile veneer of strength I had clung to. The creatures, their forms now fully transformed, rushed towards the house, their intentions clear and deadly. I ran, my legs carrying me with a speed I didn't know I possessed, driven by the primal urge to survive. The cold night air bit into my skin, but the fear of what lay behind spurred me forward. The werewolves, embodiments of our nightmares, pursued us with a relentless predatory grace that chilled my soul. The woods around me were a labyrinth of darkness, the trees and undergrowth closing in like a living, breathing entity. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation sharp and painful. The thicket was unforgiving, branches lashing out like fingers, scratching and tearing at my exposed skin. The ground beneath me was uneven, treacherous, threatening to trip me at every step. A rustle, out of place in the rhythm of my flight, pierced the night. My heart, already pounding a frantic rhythm, seemed to stop for a moment. Fear, a constant companion, tightened its grip, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I turned, my movements jerky with terror, and saw him. The other man from the basement, his eyes wide orbs of terror in the moonlight. In that fleeting moment, our eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of our shared plight. There was a kinship in that glance, a recognition of the hell we had both endured. But there was no time for words, no time for anything but survival. The night was split by a new sound, a guttural growl that spoke of death and destruction. The werewolf emerged from the shadows, a massive and menacing figure bedded in the pale light of the moon. Its presence dominated the forest, a dark deity of the night. Fear took hold, a vice around my heart, driving me forward. I turned and ran, my legs moving with a desperation born of terror. The ground seemed to tilt and sway beneath me. The forest a blur of shadows and shapes, the werewolf's growls filled the night, a soundtrack to the nightmare that unfolded. It was the sound of our doom, a promise of the horror that stalked us through the trees. The man's screams behind me, a sound so chilling it seemed to freeze the very air, marked the end of his flight. The werewolf had caught him, sealing his fate in the jaws of horror. A pang of guilt and sadness pierced me, a sharp contrast to the adrenaline that fueled my escape. The instinct to survive was a powerful force, overriding the human desire to help, to save. I pushed forward, the forest around me a blur of dark shapes and menacing shadows. The trees, once distinct entities, now merged into a single, oppressive mass, a living barrier that seemed intent on trapping me in its embrace. The forest had become a maze, a labyrinth of fear and despair, with no discernible end. Then, abruptly, the trees parted, revealing a dirt road bathed in the pale light of the moon. It was the same road that had led to our house of horrors, a path I had walked in a different life. In the moonlight lay a sight that brought me to a halt. A cart, with a dead werewolf sprawled beside it. The creature bore a large wound, the blood around it frozen in the cold night air. The sound of growls and distant shouts spurred me back into motion. I had no time to ponder over the dead werewolf, to question what had transpired there. My focus was singular, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the nightmares behind me. The distant screams of those still trapped in the forest were a grim reminder of the horror I had escaped. They echoed in my ears, a haunting symphony of terror and despair. Each cry was a voice, a story, a life being consumed by the darkness. I burst from the forest onto the road, the familiar signs of civilization, a welcome sight. The road, with its lines and boundaries, was a stark contrast to the wild chaos of the woods. It was a path to safety, a route back to the world I had been torn from. My body was on the brink of collapse, each step an exercise in sheer willpower. My muscles screamed in protest, my lungs burned for air, but the sight of the city lights ahead propelled me forward. They were beacons in the night, promises of safety, of an end to this nightmare. The city lights, shimmering in the distance, seemed like a mirage, a beautiful yet unattainable dream. But with each step, they grew closer, more tangible, a reality within reach. The promise of safety, of escape from the horror, was a powerful motivator, pushing me beyond the limits of my physical endurance. As I stumbled onto the outskirts of civilization, the sounds of the forest and the nightmarish chase faded into the background. The night air, once filled with the sounds of pursuit and terror, was now quiet, the silence a stark reminder of the ordeal I had endured. Each step was a struggle, my body pushed to its limits. Adrenaline and fear had fueled me through the forest, but now, with safety within reach, my strength waned. The city, once a distant beacon of hope, was now a tangible reality, its presence a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. I reached the outskirts of the city, the transition from the wild to the urban jarring. The trees and shadows of the forest gave way to buildings and streetlights, the sounds of nature replaced by the hum of civilization. It was a return to the familiar, yet everything felt different, altered by the experiences that had brought me here. The city was alive, its lights a stark contrast to the darkness I had left behind. But as I walked, The horrors of the basement and the forest clung to me like a second skin. The memories of those I could not save, the faces of my fellow captives, haunted me, their cries and screams echoing in my ears. My body, running on fumes, could no longer sustain me. I collapsed on the side of the road, the world spinning around me. Consciousness slipped away, the night's events enveloping me in a merciful blanket of darkness. I awoke to the sound of voices, the sensation of being lifted, of gentle hands and concerned faces. I had been found, my rescue from the forest of nightmares marking the end of one journey and the beginning of another. The hospital was a blur of white walls and soft voices, a stark contrast to the basement's oppressive darkness. I was safe, but the journey ahead was daunting. The physical scars would heal, but the psychological wounds were deep, etched into the fabric of my being. The road to recovery was long and arduous, filled with moments of despair and flashes of hope. The memories of the basement, of the werewolves and the forest, were a constant shadow, a reminder of the horrors I had faced. But in those dark times, I found solace in the memory of the boy and his father. Their decision to leave the lid open, a small act of humanity in a world bereft of compassion, had been a beacon of hope. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is kindness, there is light.